We have all had those moments where we stop and look at the world around us, and nothing seems to make sense. Maybe you are standing in a crowded subway or staring at a computer screen at 3 in the morning, and a single question hits you like a physical weight. What is the point of all this? We spend our lives working, building, and searching for a reason to be here. But the universe usually responds with a very loud and very cold silence. Most people find this realization terrifying. They turn to religion, or they lose themselves in distractions, or they simply give up. But there was a man born into the dust and heat of North Africa who looked at that silence and decided it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Albert Camus was born in 1913 in a tiny town in French Algeria called Mondovi. He didn't start his life in a library or a university. He started it in a world defined by what was missing. His father was a farm laborer who was sent off to fight in the First World War and was killed before Albert was even 1 year old. He grew up in a cramped 3-room apartment with his grandmother, his paralyzed uncle, and his mother. His mother was nearly deaf and almost entirely illiterate. She worked as a cleaning woman to keep the family fed, and she spent much of her time in a heavy, exhausted silence. Camus grew up in that silence, surrounded by poverty and the constant, grinding pressure of just trying to survive. It is a setup that should have produced a man filled with bitterness, but Camus found something else in the streets of Algiers. He found the sun and the sea. He realized that even if you have nothing, the Mediterranean sun is free, and the ocean doesn't care if you are poor. This contrast between the harshness of human life and the indifferent beauty of the world became the foundation of everything he would ever write. He was an outsider from the very beginning. He was a Frenchman in Africa, a poor kid among the wealthy, and a boy who loved life in a house that felt like a tomb. He was a brilliant student, but even his path to education felt like a stroke of luck. A teacher recognized his potential and fought for him to get a scholarship to secondary school. Without that one person seeing something in him, the world might never have heard of Albert Camus. He went on to study philosophy at the University of Algiers, but just as he was starting to find his voice, life reminded him of how fragile everything is. At the age of 17, he contracted tuberculosis. In the early 20th century, that was often a death sentence. He had to stop playing football, which he loved, and he had to abandon his dreams of a traditional academic career. He spent years staring death in the face, and it stripped away any illusions he had about the future. For Camus, philosophy wasn't something you did in a classroom. It was something you did because you were dying, and you needed to know if life was still worth living. By the time the 1930s rolled around, the world was falling apart. Camus got involved in theater and journalism, trying to find a way to fight against the injustices he saw in colonial Algeria. He joined the Communist Party for a brief moment, but he was quickly kicked out because he refused to follow the party line blindly. He couldn't stand the idea of an ideology that cared more about abstract goals than real, breathing human beings. This skepticism of the system would eventually lead him to move to Paris just as the Second World War was beginning. When the Nazis occupied France, Camus didn't just sit in cafes and talk about freedom. He joined the resistance. He became the editor of an underground newspaper called Combat. Every day he spent in Paris was a gamble with his life. He saw friends arrested, he saw people betrayed, and he saw the absolute worst of what humans can do to each other. But he also saw something else. He saw that even in the middle of a nightmare, people could choose to be decent. They could choose to resist. It was during these dark years that he finally put words to the feeling that had been haunting him since his childhood. He called it the absurd. To Camus, the absurd isn't just a fancy word for weird. It is a specific tension. It is the divorce between the human mind, which desperately wants meaning and order, and the universe, which offers absolutely none. We are like actors who have walked onto a stage only to realize there is no script, no director, and the audience is empty. Most philosophers before him tried to solve this problem by inventing a script. They said, God wrote it, or history wrote it, or science wrote it. Camus said they were all lying to themselves. He called this philosophical suicide. He argued that if you invent a meaning that isn't there, you are just running away from reality. In 1942, he published The Myth of Sisyphus, and it changed everything. He used the old Greek story of a man condemned by the gods to push a massive boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every single time he reached the top. Sisyphus is the ultimate hero of the absurd. His work is useless. His struggle is eternal. There is no hope of success. But Camus ends the essay with a shocking line. He says, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Why? Because Sisyphus knows the rock will roll back down. He knows the struggle is pointless. And in that knowledge, he is free. The gods can't hurt him if he accepts the struggle as his own. He is the master of his own days. This idea of revolt became Camus' answer to the silence of the universe. You don't kill yourself because life is meaningless, and you don't hide in a church. You live in spite of the meaninglessness. You live with your eyes wide open. You enjoy the sun, you love your friends, and you fight for justice, not because a god told you to, but because you have decided that human dignity is worth defending. After the war, Camus was a superstar. He was young, handsome, and he looked like a movie star with his trench coat and his cigarette. He was at the center of the Parisian intellectual world, but he never really fit in. He was constantly clashing with Jean-Paul Sartre, the other giant of French philosophy. Sartre believed that to change the world, you had to pick a side and be willing to use violence if necessary. He supported the Soviet Union and argued that the end justified the means. Camus couldn't go there. He remembered the silence at his mother and the poverty of his childhood. He knew that when big men talk about historical necessity and revolutionary justice, it is usually the poor and the innocent who end up getting shot. In 1951, he published The Rebel, which was a massive critique of political violence. He argued that a true rebel fights for life, not for an idea. If your revolution requires you to become a murderer, then you aren't a rebel anymore. You are just another tyrant. This book caused a permanent break between him and Sartre. The Parisian elite turned their backs on him. They called him soft. They called him a traitor to the cause. Camus found himself isolated, standing alone between the two great powers of the Cold War, refusing to join either side. Then came the Algerian War. This was the most painful chapter of his life. His home was tearing itself apart. The French colonists were committing atrocities to keep control, and the Algerian revolutionaries were using bombs and terrorism to win independence. Camus was caught in the middle. He loved Algeria, and he wanted justice for the Arab population, but he couldn't support the killing of civilians. He famously said that if he had to choose between justice and his mother, he would choose his mother. People mocked him for that, but what he meant was that abstract justice is worthless if it destroys the real people you love. He tried to call for a civilian truce, but nobody listened. Both sides hated him for his moderation. He was silenced by the very conflict he cared about most. Despite the controversy and the loneliness, the world recognized the power of his voice. In 1957, at the age of only 44, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was one of the youngest people to ever receive it. In his speech, he didn't talk about his own greatness. He talked about the silent people he grew up with. He said that the role of the writer is not to serve those who make history, but to serve those who suffer it. He felt like he was just beginning his real work. He had plans for a massive novel about his childhood, a book that would finally explain where he came from. But the absurd had one last trick to play. In January of 1960, Camus was traveling back to Paris in a car driven by his publisher and friend. He had a train ticket in his pocket, but he had decided at the last minute to go by car instead. On a straight stretch of road, a tire blew out or an axle broke, and the car slammed into a tree. Camus was killed instantly. He was 46 years old. In his briefcase, they found the unfinished manuscript of his last novel, The First Man. It was a sudden, meaningless end to a life spent studying the meaning of death. But in a strange way, it proved his point. The universe doesn't give us a clean ending. It doesn't give us a happily ever after or a grand explanation. It just gives us the moment we are in right now. Albert Camus didn't leave us a system of rules to follow. He left us a way of standing. He showed us that you can be a person who sees the darkness of the world and still chooses to love the light. He showed us that even if the boulder always rolls back down, the act of pushing it is where our dignity lies. He reminds us that in the middle of a cold and silent universe, there is an invincible summer inside every one of us if we are brave enough to look for it. He was a man who lived without illusions, but he never lived without hope. And in a world that often feels like it is losing its mind, his quiet, stubborn insistence on human decency is more important than it has ever been.